A billionaire tech mogul murdered an entire family just to teach his maid a lesson about a water spot that never existed. But he made one fatal mistake. He kept the wrong person alive. Maria Santos was supposed to break. Instead, she spent 6 months secretly documenting his crimes while scrubbing his toilets. She recorded phone calls, photographed financial documents, and built a case that would expose a human trafficking empire spanning 12 countries. The night federal agents raided his mansion, they found something Edmund Blackwood never saw coming. The grieving maid he'd tortured for months, standing in his basement trafficking operation with a knife in her hand and the evidence to destroy his entire criminal network. This is the true story of how a 23-year-old housemaid became the most dangerous person a monster ever encountered. You won't believe what she was willing to do for justice. Maria immediately apologized, bowing her head respectfully and explaining that nothing was damaged. But Edmund wasn't interested in her explanation. He grabbed her by the wrist, his grip painful and threatening, and pulled her close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne that couldn't mask the cruelty radiating from his pores. "Let me make something very clear," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "You are nothing here. Less than nothing. You exist solely for my convenience, and if you ever disappoint me again, there will be consequences that your simple mind cannot even begin to comprehend." The other servants tried to warn Maria without actually saying the words. Mrs. Chen, the elderly cook who had worked at the estate for over a decade, would shake her head sadly whenever Maria asked about Edmund's behavior. "Just do your work perfectly," she would whisper. "Never give him a reason to notice you. The ones he notices, they don't stay long." But Maria was young and still believed that hard work and good intentions could overcome any obstacle. She threw herself into her duties with renewed determination, rising before dawn to ensure every surface was spotless, every room arranged exactly to Edmund's exacting specifications. She convinced herself that if she could just prove her worth, earn his respect through her dedication, things would improve. How wrong she was. The escalation began gradually. Edmund would find fault with tasks that had been completed perfectly, screaming at Maria for imaginary infractions, while the other servants watched in helpless silence. He would change his requirements without warning, then fly into violent rages when Maria failed to anticipate his new demands. He began timing her work with a stopwatch, setting impossible deadlines and punishing her when she fell short by even a few seconds. The verbal abuse became a daily routine. Edmund seemed to take genuine pleasure in finding new ways to humiliate Maria, often doing so in front of guests who would laugh uncomfortably and look away. He would force her to stand perfectly still while he criticized everything about her appearance, her intelligence, her family background, her very existence. The psychological torture was methodical and relentless, but it was the incident with the toilet that marked the true beginning of Edmund's descent into pure evil. Maria had cleaned Edmund's master bathroom exactly as she did every morning, following the detailed checklist that had been drilled into her memory. Every surface had been scrubbed, every fixture polished to a mirror shine, every towel folded with military precision. She had even gone beyond her normal routine, spending extra time ensuring that every detail met Edmund's impossible standards. When Edmund inspected the bathroom an hour later, he claimed to have found a single water spot on the interior rim of the toilet bowl. Maria was certain no such spot existed. She had checked and double-checked every surface. But Edmund was already screaming, his face purple with manufactured rage, spittle flying from his lips as he berated her incompetence. "You disgusting animal," he roared, grabbing Maria by the hair and forcing her to her knees beside the toilet. "You can't even clean properly. What use are you? What possible reason do I have to keep you employed when you can't perform the most basic tasks?" The humiliation continued for nearly an hour. Edmund forced Maria to clean the toilet again while he stood over her, hurling insults and threats with each movement she made. Other servants passed by the open bathroom door, their faces filled with sympathy and fear, but none dared to intervene. They had learned long ago that challenging Edmund only made his cruelty worse. That night, Maria called her family for the first time in weeks. Through tears, she told her mother about the abuse, about the impossible working conditions, about the way Edmund treated her like she was less than human. Her mother, Carmen, listened with growing horror and begged Maria to quit immediately, to come home where she would be safe. But Maria couldn't bring herself to abandon her family's dreams. The money she earned at the Blackwood estate was more than she could make anywhere else, and her younger siblings were counting on her support to continue their education. She convinced herself that she could endure Edmund's cruelty if it meant securing their future. It was a decision that would soon cost her everything. The next morning, Maria arrived at work to find Edmund waiting for her with a smile that sent chills down her spine. It wasn't the smile of a man who had calmed down overnight. It was the smile of someone who had spent hours planning something terrible. "Maria," he said, his voice sickeningly sweet. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about your family back in the Philippines. Tell me, how are your little brothers and sisters doing? Still in school, I hope?" The question filled Maria with dread. She had never told Edmund specific details about her family, but somehow he seemed to know exactly how many siblings she had, where they lived, what they were studying. The realization that he had been investigating her personal life made her stomach turn. "They're fine, sir," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. Edmund's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed predatory in the morning light. "Oh, I'm sure they are. For now. But you know, Maria, I've been thinking that perhaps your performance here hasn't been quite up to my standards. Perhaps it's time I made some changes to our arrangement." The threat was clear even though Edmund never stated it directly. Maria understood that her family's safety now depended entirely on her ability to satisfy Edmund's increasingly impossible demands. She was trapped, and Edmund knew it. What Maria didn't know was that Edmund had already set in motion a plan so horrific, so unthinkably cruel, that it would shatter every assumption she had about human nature. The water spot on the toilet had been fabricated, just like so many of his other complaints. But this time, Edmund wasn't content with simple humiliation. This time he wanted to teach Maria a lesson that would break her spirit completely. As Maria began her daily cleaning routine, Edmund made a phone call that would change everything. The conversation was brief, conducted in whispers behind the closed door of his study. When he emerged 20 minutes later, his expression was one of barely contained excitement, like a child anticipating Christmas morning. The trap was set. The pieces were in motion. And Maria Santos, the hard-working young woman who had only wanted to help her family build a better life, was about to discover just how far a monster would go when given unlimited power and no consequences for his actions. The next 72 hours would test every limit of human endurance and push Maria to make choices that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But they would also reveal a strength within her that she never knew existed, and set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately bring Edmund Blackwood face to face with justice in its most devastating form. The call Edmund made that morning was to a contact he had cultivated over years of dark dealings. Victor Petrov ran a network that specialized in making problems disappear, but more importantly for Edmund's twisted purposes, he specialized in creating new problems for people who had displeased his wealthy clients. The conversation lasted exactly 7 minutes, and by the end of it, Edmund had commissioned something so unspeakable that even Victor paused before agreeing to the terms. "You understand what you're asking for," Victor had said, his heavily accented voice crackling through the encrypted phone line. "This crosses lines that most people never even approach." Edmund's response was immediate and chilling. "Most people don't have my resources or my imagination. Can you deliver what I'm requesting, or should I find someone who can?" The price was astronomical, even by Edmund's standards. But money had long ceased to have any real meaning for him, beyond its ability to purchase suffering and control. Within hours, the wheels were in motion for an operation that would unfold halfway around the world, while Maria continued her duties, completely unaware of the nightmare bearing down on her family. 3 days passed in relative quiet. Edmund seemed almost pleasant, which should have been Maria's first warning that something terrible was brewing. He complimented her work, spoke to her in civil tones, and even allowed her to take her scheduled day off without the usual interrogation about how she planned to spend her time. To anyone else, it might have looked like he was finally treating her with basic human decency. Maria used her day off to video call her family, something she hadn't been able to do in weeks due to Edmund's increasingly demanding schedule. The sight of her siblings' faces filled her with joy and renewed determination. Her youngest brother Miguel had just turned 16 and was excelling in his mathematics courses. Her sister Elena, 18, was preparing for university entrance exams and dreamed of becoming a doctor. Their mother Carmen looked tired but proud, as she showed Mariah the small improvements they had made to their home with the money she had been sending. "We miss you so much, Maria," Carmen said, her voice thick with emotion. "But we're so grateful for everything you're doing for us. You're our guardian angel." Maria smiled through her tears, promising them that their sacrifices would be worth it, that soon they would all be together in America, living the life they had always dreamed of. She told them about her work, carefully omitting any mention of Edmund's abuse, painting a picture of a challenging but manageable job that was securing their future. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, men were moving through the streets of her hometown in the Philippines. They had photographs, addresses, and detailed instructions that had been paid for with Edmund's blood money. The trap was closing, and Maria's family had no idea they were being watched. When Maria returned to work the following morning, Edmund was waiting for her in the main foyer, his face a mask of false concern. "Maria," he said, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy, "I'm afraid I have some troubling news about your family." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. Her hands began to shake as Edmund pulled out his phone and showed her a series of photographs that made her knees buckle. Her family home was in ruins, windows shattered, walls scorched black from fire. Emergency vehicles surrounded the property while neighbors stood in shocked clusters, staring at the devastation. "There was an accident," Edmund continued, his eyes never leaving Maria's face as he savored her anguish. "A gas leak, apparently. These old homes in poor neighborhoods, you know how dangerous they can be. Faulty infrastructure, no proper safety inspections." Maria's vision blurred as she stared at the images. "My family," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where is my family?" Edmund's expression shifted slightly, revealing just a hint of the monster lurking beneath his facade of concern. "I'm afraid the news isn't good, Maria. The explosion happened at night when everyone was sleeping. The authorities are telling me that there were no survivors." The words didn't register immediately. Maria's mind simply couldn't process what Edmund was telling her. Her mother, her siblings, everyone she had ever loved, gone in an instant. The phone slipped from her trembling hands and clattered to the marble floor. "Of course I understand this is a difficult time for you," Edmund continued, his voice now taking on an edge of cold calculation. "But I want you to know that I've taken the liberty of handling the funeral arrangements. Everything has been paid for, very respectfully done. Your family has been laid to rest with all ved." Maria fell to her knees, the dignity they desert keening wail of grief tearing from her throat that echoed through the mansion's vast spaces. The other servants, hearing her cries, began to gather at the edges of the foyer, their faces filled with horror and sympathy. But none of them moved to comfort her, too afraid of Edmund's wrath to risk showing compassion. Edmund allowed Maria's breakdown to continue for several minutes, watching with the detached interest of someone observing an interesting scientific experiment. When her sobs finally began to quiet, he spoke again. "Now, I know this tragedy might make you want to return home, but I've been thinking about your situation. What exactly would you be returning to? You have no family left, no home, no prospects. Here, at least, you have employment, shelter, purpose. I think it would be best if you stayed and continued your duties. Work can be therapeutic during times of grief." The cruelty of the suggestion was breathtaking. Maria looked up at Edmund through her tears, searching his face for any sign of humanity, any indication that he understood the magnitude of what he was asking. But she found nothing except cold satisfaction and barely concealed amusement. "I've also been thinking about your performance lately," Edmund continued, circling Maria like a predator stalking wounded prey. "While I appreciate that you're going through a difficult time, I can't allow personal tragedy to interfere with the standards I maintain in my home. In fact, I think this might be an opportunity for you to really prove your dedication to your position here." Maria tried to speak, to protest, to beg for time to grieve, but no words came. The shock of losing her entire family, combined with Edmund's inhuman response, had left her in a state of psychological paralysis. Edmund crouched down beside her, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. "You see, Maria, I've learned some interesting things about that explosion. It seems the gas leak wasn't entirely accidental. There are witnesses who saw suspicious activity in the area that night. People with cameras, people with connections to certain criminal organizations. If the proper authorities were to receive this information, it might change the entire investigation. The implication was clear, though Edmund never stated it directly. He was responsible for her family's death, and he wanted her to know it. The photographs, the timing, the way he had been prepared with all the details, it all made horrific sense now. This wasn't a tragedy that had befallen her family. This was murder, commissioned and orchestrated by the man standing over her broken form. Of course, Edmund continued, standing and brushing imaginary dust from his expensive suit. Such information would only come to light if I felt compelled to share it. As long as you continue to serve me faithfully to meet my expectations without complaint or failure, I see no reason why anyone needs to know the truth about what really happened to your family. Maria's grief transformed into something else entirely. Rage, pure and incandescent, began to burn in the depths of her soul. But she was smart enough to keep it hidden, to let Edmund believe that his psychological torture had achieved its intended effect of complete submission. She nodded slowly, wiping the tears from her face and struggling to her feet. "I understand, sir," she managed to say, her voice hollow and defeated. "I'll continue my work." Edmund smiled, clearly pleased with her response. "Excellent. I knew you were a practical girl beneath all that emotion. Now, I believe my private bathroom needs attention. The toilet in particular requires your special care. I trust there won't be any issues with water spots this time." As Maria walked toward the stairs, her legs shaking with each step, she began to formulate a plan that would have terrified her just hours earlier. Edmund thought he had broken her, thought he had reduced her to a compliant servant who would accept any abuse in exchange for basic survival. But he had miscalculated badly. Maria Santos was no longer the hopeful young woman who had arrived at the Blackwood estate months earlier. That woman had died along with her family in a manufactured explosion halfway around the world. What remained was something new, something forged in the crucible of unimaginable loss and tempered by rage that burned hotter than any flame. Edmund Blackwood had created his own destruction, and he didn't even know it yet. The monster thought he had won. But monsters, Maria was beginning to understand, always underestimate the fury of someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. As Maria climbed the marble staircase toward Edmund's private quarters, each step felt like walking deeper into hell itself. Her mind raced with images of her family's final moments, the terror they must have felt as flames consumed everything they had ever known. But beneath the crushing weight of grief, something else was taking root. Something dark and calculating that would have frightened her just days earlier. The master bathroom gleamed under the afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Every surface reflected Edmund's obsession with perfection, from the gold-plated fixtures to the imported Italian marble that covered every inch of the walls. This room, where she had endured countless humiliations, would now become the birthplace of her transformation. Maria began her cleaning routine with mechanical precision, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about the men Edmund must have hired, the careful planning required to make her family's murder look like an accident. The sheer coldness of orchestrating such horror while maintaining his facade of concern. This wasn't the impulsive cruelty of an angry man. This was the calculated evil of someone who viewed human life as nothing more than pieces on a chessboard. As she scrubbed the toilet that had become a symbol of her degradation, Maria made a decision that would have been impossible for the innocent girl who had answered Edmund's job advertisement. She would not run. She would not break. She would become something Edmund had never encountered before, something his money and power could not control or destroy. That evening, Maria retreated to her small room in the servants' quarters and began researching her employer with the methodical thoroughness of someone planning a military campaign. Using the estate's internet connection, she delved into Edmund's business dealings, his social connections, his charitable foundations. What she discovered painted a picture of a man whose public persona was nothing but an elaborate mask, hiding decades of corruption and cruelty. Edmund Blackwood had built his fortune through a series of hostile takeovers that had destroyed thousands of jobs and countless families. His charitable donations were carefully orchestrated tax schemes designed to enhance his reputation while actually benefiting his own business interests. The children's charities he supported were fronts for money laundering operations that funded activities far darker than Maria had initially imagined. But most importantly, Maria discovered that she wasn't Edmund's first victim. Over the past 15 years, a pattern had emerged of domestic staff who had simply vanished without explanation. Official records listed them as employees who had quit without notice, but Maria found fragments of their stories scattered across obscure forums and missing persons databases. Young women, mostly immigrants like herself, who had arrived at the Blackwood estate full of hope and dreams, only to disappear when they became inconvenient or witnessed something they shouldn't have seen. The revelation filled Maria with a cold fury that burned brighter than her grief. Edmund hadn't just murdered her family. He was a serial killer who had been operating with complete impunity for years, protected by his wealth and the silence of those too terrified to speak against him. Maria's research also revealed something else crucial to her emerging plan. Edmund's empire, while vast, was built on foundations more fragile than he realized. His legitimate businesses were leveraged to the breaking point, dependent on a complex web of offshore accounts and shell companies to maintain liquidity. His illegal activities, while profitable, had made him enemies among people far more dangerous than a grief-stricken housemaid. Over the following weeks, Maria transformed herself into the perfect servant. She anticipated Edmund's needs before he voiced them, maintained the mansion's impossible standards without complaint, and responded to his increasingly creative forms of abuse with silent submission. To all appearances, she had been completely broken by her family's death and his psychological torture. But appearances, as Edmund was about to learn, could be devastatingly deceiving. During her off hours, Maria began making contact with people from Edmund's past. She reached out to former employees who had managed to escape the estate, using encrypted messaging apps and anonymous email accounts to gather their stories. What she learned confirmed her worst suspicions and provided her with ammunition that would prove invaluable in the days to come. Sarah Martinez had worked as Edmund's personal assistant for 3 months before fleeing in the middle of the night. Through tears, she told Maria about the secret room in the basement where Edmund kept trophies from his victims. Personal belongings, photographs, even locks of hair taken as souvenirs of his conquests. James Wu, a former groundskeeper, described witnessing Edmund's business partners arriving at the estate for meetings that always took place in soundproofed rooms. He had seen men with briefcases full of cash, heard screams coming from areas of the mansion that were supposedly unoccupied, and once discovered what appeared to be human remains in the estate's incinerator. Most disturbing of all was the testimony of Elena Vasquez, who had worked as a cook before Mrs. Chen. Elena revealed that Edmund's cruelty extended far beyond psychological torture. She had seen him drug female staff members, had witnessed acts of violence that left permanent scars, and had been forced to participate in disposing of evidence when his games went too far. Each revelation added another layer to Maria's understanding of the monster she was dealing with. But instead of filling her with despair, the knowledge strengthened her resolve. She was no longer fighting just for revenge against her family's killer. She was fighting to stop a predator who would continue destroying lives until someone found the courage to stand against him. Maria's plan began to take shape with the precision of a master strategist. She would not simply kill Edmund, though every fiber of her being screamed for his blood. That would be too quick, too merciful for someone who had caused so much suffering. Instead, she would destroy him the same way he had destroyed others, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the broken shell of a man who had finally faced consequences for his actions. The first phase of her plan required patience and careful observation. Maria began documenting everything, using a hidden camera to record Edmund's abuse, photographing the contents of his private files when she cleaned his study, and mapping the layout of the mansion's hidden areas. She created multiple backup copies of everything, storing them in locations Edmund would never think to search. Simultaneously, Maria started building relationships with people who could help her when the time came. She befriended the local postal worker, establishing herself as a concerned domestic employee worried about her employer's increasingly erratic behavior. She cultivated connections with delivery drivers, repair technicians, and other service providers who regularly visited the estate, planting seeds of suspicion about Edmund's activities. Most crucially, Maria began reaching out to law enforcement officers, journalists, and prosecutors who specialized in cases involving wealthy criminals. She didn't reveal her true identity or intentions, instead posing as an anonymous source with information about potential criminal activity at the Blackwood estate. Her goal was to create a network of people who would be ready to act when she provided them with the evidence they needed. 3 months after her family's murder, Maria felt ready to begin the next phase of her plan. Edmund's routine had become predictable, his overconfidence making him careless about security measures that might have protected him from a less determined adversary. He trusted in his wealth and reputation to shield him from consequences, never imagining that someone he considered beneath his notice was capable of orchestrating his downfall. The irony wasn't lost on Maria. Edmund had created the perfect weapon against himself by murdering her family and breaking her spirit. The hopeful young woman who had arrived at his estate would never have been capable of the calculated ruthlessness required to destroy him. But the hollow-eyed servant who now cleaned his toilets and endured his abuse without complaint possessed something far more dangerous than hope or innocence. She possessed nothing left to lose and everything to gain from his destruction. As Maria prepared for bed that night, she allowed herself a small smile for the first time since receiving news of her family's death. Tomorrow would begin Edmund Blackwood's final chapter, though he wouldn't realize it until it was far too late to stop what was coming. The monster had created his own nemesis, and she was going to make sure he understood exactly what that meant before she was finished with him. Justice was coming to the Blackwood estate, and it would arrive wearing the face of a grieving maid who had learned that sometimes the only way to stop evil was to become something even more terrifying than the monsters themselves. The plan Maria had crafted over months of careful observation was about to unfold in ways Edmund could never have anticipated. But first, she needed to ensure that every detail was perfect, every contingency accounted for. The man who had orchestrated her family's murder was meticulous in his cruelty, and Maria understood that defeating him would require an even greater level of precision and ruthlessness. That morning, as Maria began her usual cleaning routine, she noticed something different about Edmund's behavior. He seemed more agitated than usual, pacing through the mansion's corridors with an energy that suggested something significant was happening behind the scenes. She had learned to read his moods like a survival manual, and today's restlessness indicated that he was planning something new. Her suspicions were confirmed when she overheard a phone conversation from outside his study door. Edmund was speaking in the hushed tones he reserved for his most sensitive business dealings, and the fragments she caught sent chills down her spine. "The shipment arrives tonight," he was saying. "Make sure the basement is prepared exactly as we discussed. This batch is particularly valuable, and I don't want any complications like last time." Maria's blood ran cold as she pieced together the implications. The research she had conducted over the past months had revealed hints of Edmund's involvement in human trafficking, but she had never found concrete evidence. Now it seemed she was about to witness his operation firsthand. The knowledge that more innocent lives were in immediate danger accelerated Maria's timeline dramatically. She could no longer afford the luxury of a slow, methodical destruction of Edmund's empire. Whatever was happening tonight would likely result in more victims, more families torn apart by his insatiable appetite for power and control. Maria spent the rest of the day in a state of controlled panic, finalizing preparations she had hoped to have weeks more to perfect. She activated Dead Man's switches on all her hidden evidence caches, ensuring that if anything happened to her, the documentation of Edmund's crimes would automatically be delivered to every law enforcement agency and news outlet she had identified. She also sent carefully crafted messages to her network of contacts, using coded language to alert them that something significant would happen at the Blackwood estate within the next 24 hours. The seeds she had planted over months of careful cultivation were about to bear fruit, but only if she could survive what was coming. As evening approached, Maria positioned herself in the mansion's security room, a space she had gained access to weeks earlier by copying the head of security's keycard during one of her cleaning sessions. From here, she could monitor the estate's extensive camera network and coordinate her actions with the arrival of Edmund's mysterious shipment. At exactly 11:30 that night, 3 unmarked vans pulled through the estate's main gates. Maria watched on the security monitors as armed men emerged from the vehicles, their movements professional and coordinated. But it was what came out of the third van that made her stomach turn with horror. Children. At least a dozen of them, ranging in age from what looked like 8 to 16, all showing signs of prolonged abuse and malnutrition. They moved with the broken shuffle of people who had given up hope, their eyes empty of everything except fear. Maria realized with crystalline clarity that this was her moment. Not tomorrow, not next week, but right now. These children were about to disappear into Edmund's basement network, and she was the only person in position to stop it from happening. Her original plan had been elegant and methodical, designed to destroy Edmund slowly while building an ironclad legal case against him. But watching those children being herded toward the mansion's basement entrance, Maria understood that sometimes justice couldn't wait for perfect timing or ideal circumstances. She activated every recording device she had planted throughout the estate, ensuring that what was about to unfold would be documented from multiple angles. Then she triggered the emergency alerts she had prepared for her law enforcement contacts, sending them the estate's address along with a message that would bring them running. Active human trafficking operation in progress. Children in immediate danger. Come now. But Maria knew that even the fastest police response would take at least 20 minutes to reach the remote estate. Those children didn't have 20 minutes. They had whatever time she could buy them with her own actions. Moving with the stealth she had perfected during months of avoiding Edmund's attention, Maria made her way to the mansion's basement level. The area had always been off-limits to regular staff, but her secret exploration had revealed a layout that was far more complex and sinister than the building's original blueprint suggested. Hidden behind false walls and concealed doorways was a network of rooms that served Edmund's darkest purposes. Soundproofed chambers where his victims were held, processing areas where they were prepared for transport, and a central hub where Edmund conducted the business of human misery with the same casual efficiency he brought to his legitimate enterprises. Maria reached the main basement corridor just as Edmund was personally inspecting the newest arrivals. He moved among the terrified children like a farmer examining livestock, occasionally lifting a chin or checking teeth with the detached professionalism of someone who had reduced human beings to mere commodities. "This batch looks promising," he was telling one of his associates, a man Maria recognized from surveillance photos as Viktor Petrov, the same contact who had arranged her family's murder. "The younger ones especially, they'll bring premium prices from our overseas clients." Hearing Edmund discuss the children's fate with such casual cruelty pushed Maria beyond the carefully controlled rage that had sustained her for months. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about stopping a monster who was actively destroying lives while she watched. Maria's hand moved to the knife she had concealed in her cleaning supplies, a blade she had sharpened to surgical precision during countless sleepless nights. Her original plan had called for subtlety, for allowing the legal system to deliver justice while she remained in the shadows. But sometimes, she realized, the only justice available was the kind that came from someone willing to get blood on their hands. She was about to step into the corridor when the sound of approaching sirens echoed through the mansion's walls. Her emergency alerts had worked faster than expected, bringing law enforcement to the estate with a speed that caught everyone off guard. Edmund's expression shifted from casual confidence to panic in the space of a heartbeat. "How did they find us?" he demanded, his voice rising above the approaching sirens. "This location is supposed to be completely secure." Victor was already barking orders to his men, coordinating an evacuation plan that would leave the children behind while Edmund and his core associates escaped through hidden exit routes. Maria watched as they prepared to abandon their victims to face whatever consequences the police response might bring. That was when Maria Santos made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She stepped out of the shadows and into the corridor, her voice cutting through the chaos with startling clarity. "Edmund Blackwood," she called out, her tone carrying none of the submissive deference he had grown accustomed to hearing from her. "I think it's time we had a real conversation." Every person in the corridor turned toward her, but Maria's eyes were locked on Edmund's face as recognition dawned. The broken servant he thought he had created was standing before him, with the bearing of someone who held all the cards in a game he was only now realizing he had lost. "Maria?" Edmund's voice cracked with confusion and the first hint of genuine fear she had ever seen him display. "What are you doing down here? I told you this area was forbidden." Maria smiled, and the expression contained none of the warmth or hope that had once defined her personality. This was the smile of someone who had stared into the abyss and discovered that monsters weren't born. They were made by people exactly like the man standing before her. "You murdered my family," she said simply, her voice carrying across the basement with perfect clarity. "You destroyed my life because I missed a water spot that never existed. And now you're going to learn what happens when someone decides that your existence is the real stain that needs to be cleaned." The sirens were getting closer now, their wailing promise of justice echoing through the estate's halls. But Maria wasn't interested in waiting for outside intervention anymore. She had become something that Edmund's money couldn't buy, his influence couldn't control, and his cruelty couldn't break. She had become his reckoning. Edmund took a step backward, his confident facade crumbling as he finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. The woman he had tortured and humiliated was standing in his basement sanctuary, surrounded by evidence of his crimes, with law enforcement closing in from all directions. But more terrifying than any of those external threats was the look in Maria's eyes. It was the gaze of someone who had already died inside and had nothing left to lose. Someone who had been forged in the furnace of unimaginable loss and had emerged as something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined possible. "You can't do this," Edmund stammered, his voice losing all authority as panic overtook his usual commanding presence. "Do you have any idea who I am? What I'm capable of?" Maria's smile widened, revealing a depth of darkness that would have been impossible for the hopeful young woman who had once cleaned his toilets with such dedication. "Oh, Edmund," she said softly, pulling the knife from her cleaning supplies with deliberate slowness. "I know exactly who you are. The question is, do you know who I've become?" The sound of police vehicles screeching to a halt outside the mansion, mixed with the terrified whimpers of the children and the panicked shouts of Edmund's associates. But in that basement corridor, the only thing that mattered was the confrontation between a monster and the woman he had created through his own unthinkable cruelty. Edmund Blackwood was about to learn that some stains could never be cleaned, and some debts could only be paid in blood. The game had changed completely, and Maria Santos was no longer playing by his rules. The basement fell into a silence so complete that the only sounds were the distant sirens growing closer and the rapid breathing of terrified children huddled against the cold concrete walls. Maria's transformation was so absolute, so unexpected, that even Victor's hardened criminals seemed frozen by the sheer audacity of what they were witnessing. Edmund's mind raced through calculations that had served him well throughout his career of exploitation and murder. Money, influence, threats, violence. These were the tools he understood, the weapons he wielded with surgical precision. But standing before this woman he had systematically destroyed, Edmund realized that none of his usual solutions applied to the situation unfolding around him. "Maria," he said, forcing his voice back into the patronizing tone he had used to control her for so long. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Your family's death was a genuine tragedy, but you can't seriously believe I had anything to do with it. I'm a respected businessman, a philanthropist. These accusations are the delusions of someone consumed by grief." Maria tilted her head slightly, studying Edmund with the detached interest of an entomologist examining a particularly disgusting specimen. The gesture was eerily reminiscent of the way he had looked at her during his worst moments of cruelty, and the parallel wasn't lost on anyone present. "Tell me, Edmund," Maria said, her voice carrying a conversational tone that made the knife in her hand seem even more threatening. "When you called Victor to arrange my family's murder, did you feel anything at all? A moment of hesitation? A flicker of conscience? Or was it just another business transaction for you?" Victor stepped forward, his hand moving toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. But Maria's eyes shifted to him with such intensity that he froze mid-motion, suddenly uncertain about his ability to control this situation through conventional intimidation. "Victor Petrov," Maria continued, never taking her gaze off the trafficker. "Born in Vladivostok, 3 children living in Moscow under assumed names, a wife who thinks you work in import-export. You've been Edmund's cleaner for 8 years, responsible for at least 47 deaths that I've been able to document. The authorities have been looking for you for quite some time." The precision of her knowledge sent ripples of unease through the assembled criminals. This wasn't the desperate outburst of a grieving servant. This was the calculated revelation of someone who had done her homework with the thoroughness of a professional investigator. "How do you know that?" Victor demanded, his accent thickening with stress. Who are you working for? Are you? Maria's laugh was soft, almost musical, but it contained an edge that made everyone in the corridor take an unconscious step backward. I'm working for justice, Victor. Something you wouldn't recognize if it carved your name into your forehead. The sirens outside had stopped, replaced by the sounds of vehicles' doors slamming and tactical teams coordinating their approach. Edmund's security system, which he had always viewed as impenetrable, was now working against him as law enforcement used his own cameras to track the estate's layout and plan their entry strategy. They'll never get past my security, Edmund said, desperation creeping into his voice, despite his attempts to project confidence. This estate is a fortress. We have time to sort this out, to come to some kind of arrangement. Maria shook her head slowly, her expression almost pitying. Your security chief, Marcus Webb, has been feeding information to federal investigators for 6 months. Every entry code, every safe room location, every escape route you think you have. He's been building a case against you since his daughter disappeared during one of your previous operations. The revelation hit Edmund like a physical blow. Marcus had been with him for over a decade, one of the few people he had trusted with knowledge of his true activities. The idea that his most trusted ally had been systematically betraying him shattered Edmund's worldview in ways that went beyond simple betrayal. That's impossible, Edmund whispered, his face going pale as the implications sank in. Marcus would never betray me. I own him. You owned his silence, Maria corrected, taking a step closer to Edmund while the children watched in fascination and terror. But you made the same mistake with him that you made with me. You assumed that breaking someone's spirit was the same as owning their soul. Marcus has been planning your downfall for years, just like I have. Victor was backing toward one of the concealed exits, his survival instincts finally overriding his professional obligations to Edmund. But Maria's voice stopped him before he could reach the hidden door. I wouldn't recommend running, Victor. The federal agents surrounding this estate have been briefed on your appearance, your vehicle, and the location of every bolt hole you might try to use. Your best chance of seeing your children again is to surrender peacefully and cooperate with the investigation. The mention of his family hit Victor harder than any physical threat could have. He turned back toward Maria, his professional composure finally cracking to reveal the desperation beneath. What do you want? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Money? Safe passage? Name your price. Maria's expression softened slightly, but not with mercy. Instead, she looked at Victor with something approaching pity, the way someone might regard a rabid animal that needed to be put down for everyone's safety. I want you to understand something that neither you nor Edmund seems to grasp, she said quietly. There are some things in this world that can't be bought, can't be negotiated, can't be threatened away. You murdered my family because a rich man paid you to do it. You've spent years destroying lives because it was profitable. But profit and loss don't apply to what's happening here tonight. The sound of tactical teams breaching the mansion's main entrances echoed down to the basement level. Edmund's fortress was falling room by room, his empire of cruelty collapsing under the weight of evidence that had been carefully compiled by people he had underestimated. But Maria wasn't finished with her revelations. She had spent months preparing for this moment, and she intended to make sure both men understood exactly how completely they had been outmaneuvered. Edmund, she said, turning her full attention back to the man who had orchestrated her family's destruction. Do you remember what you said to me the morning you told me about the explosion? You said that work could be therapeutic during times of grief. You were right about that, but probably not in the way you intended. She gestured toward the children huddled against the walls, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror, as they listened to the sounds of rescue approaching. My work hasn't been cleaning your toilets or polishing your floors. My work has been documenting every crime you've committed, every life you've destroyed, every family you've torn apart. I've been building the case that will ensure you spend the rest of your life in a cage where you belong. Edmund's legs gave out, and he collapsed against the concrete wall as the full scope of his situation became clear. The woman he had tortured for months had been systematically destroying his life while maintaining the perfect facade of a broken servant. Every cruel word, every humiliation, every moment of psychological torture had been observed and recorded by someone who was planning his ultimate destruction. The water spot, he gasped, understanding finally dawning. There never was a water spot. Maria's smile returned, cold and satisfied. There never was a water spot, Edmund. Just like there was never any real reason to murder my family except your own twisted need to demonstrate your power. But you made one crucial mistake in your calculations. She knelt down beside Edmund, bringing her face close to his so that her words would be perfectly clear, despite the chaos erupting throughout the mansion above them. You assumed that destroying someone's life would make them disappear? Instead, you created someone who had nothing left to lose and every reason to ensure that you paid for your crimes. The tactical teams had reached the basement level now, their voices echoing through the corridors as they systematically cleared each room. The children began crying with relief as the sounds of rescue grew closer, while Edmund's remaining associates scattered like roaches exposed to sudden light. But Maria remained perfectly still, the knife in her hand forgotten as she savored the moment of Edmund's complete defeat. She had imagined this confrontation countless times during the darkest hours of her grief, but the reality was more satisfying than any fantasy could have been. The authorities will find evidence linking you to over 200 murders, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the confined space. Human trafficking networks spanning 12 countries. Financial crimes that will require teams of forensic accountants years to fully unravel. And every single piece of evidence has been carefully documented and preserved by the woman you thought you had broken. Edmund tried to speak, to offer some final bargain or threat, but no words came. The man who had built an empire through manipulation and intimidation had been reduced to a trembling figure on a basement floor, destroyed by someone he had considered beneath his notice. The first tactical officers rounded the corner, their weapons raised and their movements coordinated with military precision. They took in the scene quickly, identifying Maria as the source who had provided them with intelligence, while Edmund and Victor were clearly the primary targets. "Ma'am," the lead officer called out, his voice professional but concerned. "Please step away from the suspects and identify yourself." Maria stood slowly, letting the knife fall to the concrete floor with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo with finality. She raised her hands in surrender, but her eyes never left Edmund's face as she savored his expression of complete defeat. "My name is Maria Santos," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the basement. "I'm the woman whose family was murdered by Edmund Blackwood, and I'm the person who's been documenting his crimes for the past 6 months. Everything you need to convict him is waiting in the evidence packages I've prepared." The officers moved quickly to secure the scene, separating the suspects while medical personnel attended to the traumatized children. But as Edmund was lifted from the floor and placed in restraints, Maria found herself face to face with the man who had destroyed her old life and created her new one. "This isn't over," Edmund whispered, his voice filled with venom despite his helpless position. "You have no idea what you've started. The people I work with, the connections I have, they'll never let you live peacefully after this." Maria's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes made Edmund recoil as if he had been struck. She leaned closer, speaking so quietly that only he could hear her final words. "Edmund," she said softly, "the woman who might have been intimidated by those threats died in a house fire in the Philippines 6 months ago. The person standing here now is someone you created through your own cruelty, and she's not afraid of anything you or your associates might try to do. Because the worst thing that could ever happen to me has already happened. And I survived it. I thrived because of it." She straightened up as the officers began leading Edmund toward the stairs, but she wasn't finished with her final message. "When you're sitting in your prison cell, when you're wondering how everything went so wrong so quickly, I want you to remember that it all started with a water spot that never existed. Remember that your downfall began the moment you decided to murder an innocent family to teach a lesson to someone you considered insignificant." Edmund was halfway up the stairs when Maria's voice reached him one last time, carrying clearly through the basement corridor that had been his seat of power just minutes earlier. "And Edmund," she called out, her tone almost conversational. "When they ask you in court how you were brought down by a simple housemaid, make sure you tell them the truth. Tell them that monsters create their own enemies, and sometimes those enemies are more patient and more ruthless than the monsters themselves." The basement fell silent except for the sounds of the children being led to safety and the distant noise of law enforcement processing, what would become one of the largest human trafficking busts in federal history. Maria stood alone in the space where her transformation had been completed, surrounded by the wreckage of Edmund Blackwood's empire of cruelty. She had entered this basement as Maria Santos, the grieving servant who cleaned toilets and endured abuse in silence. But she was leaving as something entirely different, someone who had stared into the heart of human evil and had found the strength to stare back without blinking. The woman who had dreamed of bringing her family to America for a better life was gone forever, consumed by flames in a distant country. But what had risen from those ashes was something Edmund Blackwood had never anticipated when he decided to teach her a lesson about her place in his world. He had created his own destroyer, and she had proven more thorough and more patient than he could ever have imagined. Justice had come to the Blackwood estate not in the form of law enforcement or legal proceedings, but in the shape of a woman who had been pushed beyond every limit and had discovered that sometimes the only way to stop a monster was to become something even more terrifying. As Maria walked up the basement stairs toward whatever future awaited her, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with the knowledge that no other families would suffer because of Edmund Blackwood's twisted appetites. The monster was caged, his empire was destroyed, and the children who had been destined for unthinkable fates were safe. It was more justice than Maria had ever dared to hope for when she began her patient campaign of destruction. But as she emerged into the mansion's main floor where federal agents were systematically dismantling everything Edmund had built, Maria understood that her story was far from over. The woman who had brought down one of the most dangerous criminals in the country was about to discover what happened next in a world that didn't quite know what to do with someone like her. Edmund Blackwood's reign of terror was finished, but Maria Santos's journey into the darkness was just beginning to reveal its true destination. The federal agents processing the scene moved with the efficiency of people who had dealt with similar horrors before. But Maria could see the shock in their faces as they documented each piece of evidence she had meticulously preserved. 6 months of careful planning had created a prosecution case so airtight that even Edmund's army of expensive lawyers would find no cracks to exploit. Special Agent Sarah Chen approached Maria with the cautious respect reserved for someone who had just accomplished something extraordinary. Ms. Santos, I need you to understand that what you've done here tonight has saved dozens of lives and exposed a criminal network we've been trying to penetrate for years. But I also need to ask you about some of the methods you used to gather this intelligence. Maria nodded, understanding the delicate position she now occupied. She had operated outside the law in ways that could complicate the prosecution of Edmund and his associates, but she had also delivered them the most comprehensive criminal case in the Bureau's recent history. Agent Chen? Maria replied, her voice carrying the same measured tone she had perfected during months of deception. Everything I did was in service of stopping a man who had murdered my entire family and was actively destroying other lives. I documented crimes as I witnessed them, preserved evidence as I found it, and alerted authorities the moment innocent children were in immediate danger. The careful phrasing wasn't accidental. Maria had spent weeks studying legal precedents and constitutional law, preparing for exactly this conversation. She understood that her actions existed in a gray area that could either make her a hero or a criminal, depending on how prosecutors chose to interpret her methods. Agent Chen studied Maria with the analytical gaze of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. The evidence you've provided is extraordinary in its detail and scope. Phone recordings, financial documents, video surveillance, witness testimonies. This represents months of professional-level intelligence gathering. Where did you learn these skills? Maria's smile was enigmatic, revealing nothing of the countless sleepless nights she had spent teaching herself surveillance techniques, studying criminal law, and learning to navigate the dark web where Edmund's associates conducted their business. Grief is a powerful teacher, Agent Chen. When someone destroys everything you care about, you discover capabilities you never knew you possessed. The truth was more complex than Maria was willing to reveal. Her transformation from naive housemaid to criminal mastermind hadn't happened overnight. It had required her to become someone completely different, to shed every trace of the hopeful young woman who had arrived at the Blackwood estate with dreams of helping her family. During those first weeks after learning of her family's murder, Maria had considered suicide. The weight of losing everyone she loved, combined with the knowledge that their killer was beyond the reach of conventional justice, had nearly crushed her spirit completely. But in her darkest moments, she had realized that ending her own life would be the final victory for Edmund's cruelty. Instead, she had chosen to become something else entirely. She studied Edmund with the intensity of a doctoral student, learning his habits, his weaknesses, his networks of criminal associates. She taught herself skills that would have taken intelligence professionals years to master, driven by a focus that came from having nothing left to lose. The basement where Edmund's empire had finally collapsed was being systematically dismantled by forensic specialists who seemed amazed by the scope of evidence Maria had preserved. Every conversation she had recorded, every document she had photographed, every financial transaction she had traced, it all painted a picture of criminal enterprise so vast that prosecutors were already talking about trials that would last for years. But Maria's attention wasn't focused on the technical aspects of evidence processing. She was watching the children who had been rescued from Edmund's trafficking operation, seeing the mixture of terror and hope in their eyes as medical personnel examined them, and social workers began the delicate process of learning their identities and stories. These children represented something Maria hadn't expected to feel again after her family's death. They gave her a purpose that extended beyond revenge, a reason to continue existing in a world that had taken everything she had once cared about. Saving them had transformed her mission from personal vengeance into something larger and more meaningful. "Ms. Santos," Agent Chen continued, her voice softer now as she seemed to recognize the depth of trauma that had driven Maria's actions. "I want you to know that the Bureau is prepared to offer you protection during the prosecution phase. Edmund Blackwood's criminal network extends far beyond what we've uncovered tonight, and there may be associates who view you as a threat to their continued operations." Maria considered the offer carefully. Protection would mean living under constant surveillance, surrendering the independence she had fought so hard to reclaim after months of being controlled by Edmund's cruelty. But it would also mean staying alive long enough to testify against the man who had destroyed her family. "What kind of protection are we talking about?" Maria asked, her tone indicating that she had no intention of disappearing into witness protection or abandoning the life she had built from the ashes of Edmund's torture. Agent Chen hesitated, clearly recognizing that Maria wasn't someone who could be easily managed or controlled. "We can provide security details, safe house accommodations, relocation assistance if necessary. But given the scope of this case and the international nature of the criminal network involved, we're looking at a long-term commitment to your safety." Maria shook her head slowly, her decision already made. "Agent Chen, I appreciate the offer, but I think you misunderstand who I am now. The woman who might have needed your protection died 6 months ago in a house fire in the Philippines. The person standing here has already survived the worst thing that could possibly happen to her, and she's not interested in hiding from whatever comes next." The agent's expression showed both admiration and concern. "Miss Sanos, these aren't ordinary criminals we're dealing with. Edmund's associates have resources and connections that make them extremely dangerous. They've killed people for far less than what you've done to their operation." Maria's laugh was soft but carried an edge that made several nearby agents turn to look at her. "Let them come, Agent Chen. I've spent 6 months learning everything there is to know about Edmund's criminal network, including the identities and weaknesses of every major player. If they want to continue this war, they'll discover that I'm not the same person who once cleaned their leaders' toilets." The conversation was interrupted by commotion near the mansion's main entrance. Edmund was being led to a transport vehicle, his hands cuffed behind his back, and his head covered to protect him from the media cameras that had already begun gathering outside the estate. Even in defeat, he commanded attention, his presence drawing reporters and law enforcement officials like moths to a flame. Maria watched through the mansion's windows as Edmund was placed in the back of an armored transport vehicle. For months, she had imagined this moment, the satisfaction of seeing the man who had destroyed her family finally facing consequences for his actions. But the reality was more complex than her fantasies had suggested. She felt no joy in Edmund's capture, no sense of closure or completion. Instead, she experienced something closer to grim satisfaction, mixed with the knowledge that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Edmund's arrest would create a power vacuum in his criminal network, and other predators would move quickly to fill the void he left behind. "Agent Chen, Maria said, turning away from the window as Edmund's transport disappeared into the night. I want to make you an offer. The agent raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by Maria's tone. What kind of offer? Maria's expression was serious, carrying the weight of someone who had spent months thinking about this moment. I know more about Edmund's criminal network than anyone else you're likely to encounter. I have contacts, intelligence sources, and evidence that could help you dismantle the entire operation instead of just cutting off its head. You're talking about working with the Bureau, Agent Chen said carefully. That's not something we typically offer to civilian witnesses, especially ones who've operated outside legal channels. Maria nodded, understanding the complications her proposal would create. I'm not interested in becoming a federal agent or following Bureau protocols, but I am interested in making sure that everyone who profited from my family's death faces the same justice that Edmund is about to experience. The offer hung in the air between them, representing a partnership that would challenge conventional law enforcement practices while potentially delivering results that traditional investigations could never achieve. Maria had proven her capabilities by single-handedly bringing down one of the most elusive criminal masterminds in the country. The question now was whether the federal government was prepared to work with someone whose methods existed outside their normal operational parameters. Agent Chen studied Maria with renewed interest, clearly recognizing that this wasn't a typical witness protection scenario. What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Santos? Maria's smile was cold and calculating, revealing the predator she had become during her months of careful planning. I'm proposing that we finish what Edmund started when he decided to murder my family. His criminal network extends into a dozen countries and involves hundreds of people who profit from human suffering. Traditional law enforcement methods will take years to identify and prosecute these individuals, assuming you can penetrate their security at all. She gestured toward the basement where Edmund's trafficking operation had been exposed. I infiltrated his organization in 6 months and gathered enough evidence to destroy him completely. Imagine what I could accomplish with federal resources and legal backing. The proposal was audacious, representing a fundamental shift in how federal agencies approached complex criminal networks. But it also offered the possibility of dismantling in months what might otherwise take years of traditional investigation to uncover. Agent Chen was quiet for several moments, clearly weighing the unprecedented nature of Maria's offer against the potential benefits it represented. This would require approval from levels far above my authority, she finally said. The kind of partnership you're describing doesn't exist in our current operational framework. Maria's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested that she had expected this response. Then perhaps it's time to create a new framework, Agent Chen. Edmund's network operates globally, using methods that traditional law enforcement struggles to counter. Fighting them effectively requires someone who understands their methods, because she's lived through their cruelty. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of federal prosecutors who needed to begin the complex process of preparing charges against Edmund and his associates. But as Maria was led away for formal debriefing, she caught Agent Chen's eye one final time. Think about it, Agent Chen, she said quietly. Edmund made one crucial mistake when he decided to destroy my life instead of simply killing me. He created someone with nothing left to lose and every motivation to ensure that his entire world burns to the ground. You can either help me do it legally or you can watch me do it on my own. The threat wasn't subtle and it wasn't empty. Maria had already proven her capability to operate outside legal boundaries when necessary, and her success in bringing down Edmund demonstrated that she possessed skills and determination that could be either valuable assets or dangerous obstacles to law enforcement efforts. As Maria disappeared into the federal building for what would be the first of many lengthy debriefing sessions, Agent Chen found herself facing a decision that would define her career and potentially reshape how the Bureau approached international criminal networks. The woman who had destroyed Edmund Blackwood's empire was offering to turn her unique skills and ruthless determination toward dismantling the entire criminal ecosystem that had profited from human suffering. The question wasn't whether she could deliver on her promises. Her track record spoke for itself. The question was whether the federal government was prepared to work with someone whose methods challenged every conventional approach to law enforcement. Maria Santos had transformed from victim to predator in the span of 6 months. And now she was offering to become something even more dangerous. She was offering to become justice itself, operating with the backing of federal authority, but guided by a moral code that had been forged in the crucible of unimaginable loss. The decision facing Agent Chen and her superiors would determine whether Maria's war against human trafficking would continue as a solitary crusade or evolve into something far more systematic and devastating to the criminal networks that had thrived in the shadows for so long. Either way, Maria's transformation was far from complete. The woman who had once dreamed of bringing her family to America had become something that even Edmund's worst nightmares couldn't have anticipated. And she was just getting started. In the sterile interrogation room where she now sat, waiting for the next phase of her journey to begin, Maria allowed herself a moment to remember the faces of her murdered family. Their deaths had created the monster that destroyed Edmund Blackwood, but their memory would guide whatever came next in her war against the forces that preyed on the innocent. The girl who had cleaned toilets was gone forever. In her place sat someone who had learned that sometimes the only way to stop evil was to become something even more terrifying than the monsters themselves. And Maria Santos was about to show the world exactly how terrifying that could be. The federal building's interrogation rooms had witnessed countless confessions, plea bargains, and desperate attempts at negotiation over the years. But Agent Chen had never encountered anyone quite like Maria Santos. The woman sitting across from her possessed a composure that seemed almost unnatural, given the magnitude of what had unfolded at the Blackwood estate just hours earlier. Maria's hands rested calmly on the metal table, unmarked by the violence that had defined her recent months. Her eyes held a clarity that spoke of someone who had moved beyond conventional emotions like fear or uncertainty. She had become something that transcended the normal boundaries of victim and perpetrator, existing in a space that made seasoned federal agents uncomfortable with their standard operating procedures. "Let's start from the beginning," Agent Chen said, activating the recording equipment that would capture every word of what promised to be an extraordinary testimony. "Tell me about your first day at the Blackwood estate." Maria's smile was slight but unmistakably predatory. "Which beginning would you prefer, Agent Chen? The beginning where I was an innocent young woman hoping to help her family? Or the beginning where I became someone capable of dismantling a criminal empire that had operated with impunity for over a decade?" The distinction wasn't semantic. Maria understood that her story contained multiple origin points, each representing a fundamental transformation in her identity and capabilities. The naive housemaid who had answered Edmund's job advertisement bore no resemblance to the calculating strategist who had orchestrated his downfall. "Start with your arrival at the estate," Agent Chen instructed, though she suspected that the real story would emerge in the spaces between Maria's carefully chosen words. Maria leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed despite the gravity of the situation. "I arrived at the Blackwood estate on March 15th, carrying dreams that now seem laughably innocent. I thought I understood what wealth looked like, what power meant, what cruelty could accomplish. I was wrong about everything." She paused, allowing the weight of that admission to settle in the sterile air of the interrogation room. "Edmund's first lesson was simple but effective. He taught me that my previous understanding of human nature was dangerously naive. People like him don't operate according to the moral frameworks that govern normal society." Agent Chen made notes while studying Maria's demeanor. The woman showed no signs of the trauma that typically accompanied victims of prolonged abuse. Instead, she displayed the analytical detachment of someone who had processed her experiences and transformed them into strategic advantages. "When did you first suspect that Edmund was involved in activities beyond simple domestic abuse?" Agent Chen asked, her pen poised above her notepad. Maria's laugh was soft but carried an edge that made the agent look up sharply. "Agent Chen, I think you're misunderstanding the timeline. Edmund didn't hide his criminal activities from me because he assumed I was too broken to be a threat. He flaunted them because he enjoyed having an audience for his power." The revelation shifted the entire context of Maria's testimony. This wasn't a story about gradually discovering her employer's dark secrets. This was an account of someone who had been deliberately exposed to horrific crimes and had found a way to weaponize that knowledge against her tormentor. "He showed you his operations intentionally?" Agent Chen pressed, her voice betraying surprise despite her professional training. Maria nodded, her expression growing darker as she accessed memories that would have destroyed a weaker person. "Edmund was a collector, Agent Chen. He collected art, rare books, expensive wines, and human suffering. He needed witnesses to his power, people who could appreciate the scope of what he controlled. She gestured toward the recording equipment with casual indifference. The basement you raided tonight wasn't his only facility. It wasn't even his primary operation. Edmund maintained a network of properties across 3 continents, each serving different aspects of his business model. Agent Chen's pen stopped moving as the implications of Maria's statement became clear. You're saying there are other locations? Other victims? Maria's smile was cold and satisfied. I'm saying that what you discovered tonight represents approximately 15% of Edmund's total criminal enterprise. The trafficking operation, the money laundering, the contract killings, they were all components of a much larger ecosystem of human misery. The interrogation room fell silent as Agent Chen processed the magnitude of what Maria was revealing. The Blackwood estate raid had been celebrated as a major victory against international human trafficking. But according to Maria's testimony, it was merely scratching the surface of a criminal network that dwarfed anything federal investigators had previously encountered. Why didn't you contact authorities sooner? Agent Chen asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Maria's expression hardened, revealing glimpses of the rage that had sustained her through months of careful planning. Because Edmund owned authorities, Agent Chen. Local police, federal agents, prosecutors, judges. His charitable donations weren't just tax write-offs. They were investments in a protection network that made him effectively untouchable through conventional channels. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Do you want to know how I learned about the extent of his corruption? Edmund showed me surveillance footage of a federal agent accepting payment to suppress an investigation into missing children. He made me watch while he explained how easy it was to purchase silence from people who were supposed to protect the innocent. Agent Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. Are you saying that federal agents were compromised? Maria's laugh was bitter and knowing. Agent Chen, I'm saying that Edmund's network included people at every level of law enforcement, from beat cops to federal prosecutors. The only reason you were able to raid his estate tonight is because I spent months identifying which authorities could be trusted and which ones were already in his pocket. The implications were staggering. If Maria's testimony was accurate, then the federal investigation had been compromised from the beginning, and only her intervention had prevented Edmund from receiving advance warning of the raid. How did you identify the compromised personnel? Agent Chen asked, her training warring with the growing realization that everything she thought she knew about this case was wrong. Maria's smile returned, cold and calculating. The same way I identified everything else about Edmund's operations, Agent Chen. I became invisible. A broken servant who cleaned toilets and emptied trash cans. Someone so beneath notice that powerful men discussed their secrets in front of me without concern. She gestured toward the walls of the interrogation room with casual indifference. For 6 months, I was present during phone calls where Edmund discussed which federal agents were providing him with intelligence. I cleaned conference rooms where he met with prosecutors to negotiate outcomes for cases that should have sent him to prison decades ago. Agent Chen realized that her assumptions about this case had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Maria wasn't just a witness to Edmund's crimes. She was an intelligence asset who had penetrated deeper into his organization than any federal investigation had ever managed. The evidence you provided, Agent Chen said carefully, it's more comprehensive than anything our organized crime task forces have produced in years of investigation. Where did you learn surveillance techniques, document authentication, financial analysis? Maria's expression grew distant, as if she were remembering a different person entirely. I learned them the way people learn to survive, Agent Chen. When someone destroys your entire world and leaves you with nothing but rage and time, you discover that the human mind is capable of extraordinary adaptation. The truth was more complex than Maria was willing to reveal in detail. Her transformation had required her to essentially rebuild her personality from the ground up, replacing hope and trust with calculation and ruthlessness. She had studied criminal investigation techniques with the intensity of someone whose life depended on mastering them completely. The financial records alone represent months of analysis, Agent Chen continued, clearly struggling to understand how a domestic servant had acquired such sophisticated skills. The shell company structures, the offshore account networks, the cryptocurrency transactions. This is graduate-level forensic accounting. Maria's response was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had long since moved beyond concerns about credibility or believability. When you have unlimited access to someone's private files and no moral constraints about how you use that information, graduate-level expertise becomes surprisingly achievable. She paused, allowing Agent Chen to absorb the implications of what she was hearing. Edmund made the mistake of treating me like furniture, Agent Chen. Furniture that was present during every significant business meeting, every criminal planning session, every moment when he thought his secrets were safe. The interrogation continued for hours, with Maria methodically revealing details that painted a picture of criminal enterprise so vast and sophisticated that it challenged everything federal investigators thought they knew about organized crime. But more disturbing than the scope of Edmund's operations was the realization that Maria had infiltrated and documented everything with a precision that suggested capabilities far beyond what any civilian should possess. "Ms. Santos," Agent Chen finally said as dawn light began filtering through the interrogation room's small window. "I need to ask you directly. Are you working for any intelligence agencies? Foreign governments? Criminal organizations?" Maria's laugh was genuinely amused, the first expression of actual humor she had shown during the entire interrogation. "Agent Chen, I'm working for justice. Nothing more, nothing less. The fact that I've accomplished more in 6 months than your task forces have managed in years should tell you something about the limitations of conventional law enforcement approaches." She stood from her chair with fluid grace, despite having sat motionless for hours. "I've given you enough information to dismantle Edmund's North American operations completely, but that's just the beginning of what's possible if you're willing to think beyond traditional investigative methods." Agent Chen looked up from her notes, recognizing that this conversation had moved beyond standard witness debriefing into something resembling a negotiation between equals. "What exactly are you proposing?" Maria's smile was sharp and predatory, revealing the hunter she had become during months of patient stalking. "I'm proposing that we discuss the terms under which I might be willing to help you understand the true scope of what Edmund built and how to destroy it completely." The offer hung in the air between them, representing possibilities that challenged every protocol Agent Chen had been trained to follow. Maria Santos had proven her capabilities by accomplishing what entire federal task forces had failed to achieve. But she had also demonstrated a willingness to operate outside legal boundaries that made her simultaneously invaluable and dangerous. "This would require approvals from the highest levels of government," Agent Chen said carefully. "The kind of partnership you're describing doesn't exist in our current legal framework." Maria's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested that she had expected this response and had already prepared for it. "Then perhaps it's time to create new frameworks, Agent Chen. Edmund's network operates globally, using methods that traditional law enforcement can't counter effectively. Fighting them requires someone who understands their methods because she's lived through their consequences." She moved toward the interrogation room door with casual confidence, clearly indicating that this conversation was ending on her terms rather than the agent's. "I'll give you 72 hours to discuss my proposal with whoever needs to authorize unconventional approaches to international criminal networks." Agent Chen stood quickly, recognizing that she was losing control of the situation. "Missy Santos, you're not free to leave. You're a material witness in a federal investigation, and there are protocols that must be followed." Maria turned back with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Agent Chen, I've just handed you the largest criminal prosecution in federal history. Edmund's arrest, the evidence I provided, the intelligence networks I've exposed, none of that would exist without my intervention." Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more authority than any shout could have managed. "I'm not your prisoner, Agent Chen. I'm your partner. If you're smart enough to recognize what that means. If you're not, then I'll continue my work through other channels." The threat wasn't subtle, and it carried the weight of someone who had already proven her ability to operate independently with devastating effectiveness. Maria had brought down Edmund Blackwood using nothing but patience, intelligence, and absolute ruthlessness. The question facing federal authorities wasn't whether she could continue that work without their cooperation. The question was whether they were prepared to be partners or obstacles in whatever came next. As Maria reached for the door handle, Agent Chen made a decision that would define the rest of her career. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying a note of resignation mixed with professional curiosity. "Assuming we could find a way to make this work, what would you need from us?" Maria's smile widened, revealing satisfaction that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this question. "I would need access to federal databases, international intelligence networks, and the legal authority to operate in ways that civilian investigators cannot." She turned back toward Agent Chen, with the bearing of someone who had already won this negotiation. "But most importantly, I would need partners who understand that fighting monsters sometimes requires methods that make conventional law enforcement uncomfortable." The conversation that followed would reshape how federal agencies approached international criminal networks. But it would also create something unprecedented in law enforcement history: a partnership between traditional investigators and someone whose methods existed entirely outside normal operational parameters. Maria Santos had destroyed Edmund Blackwood by becoming something he never expected to encounter. Now she was offering to become something equally unexpected for the federal government: a weapon against criminal networks that operated beyond the reach of conventional justice. The question wasn't whether she could deliver on her promises. Her track record spoke for itself. The question was whether federal authorities were prepared to work with someone whose definition of justice had been forged in the crucible of unimaginable loss and tempered by a patience that could plan destruction 6 months in advance. Either way, Maria's war against human trafficking was about to enter a new phase. The only question was whether it would continue as a solitary crusade or evolve into something far more systematic and devastating to the criminal networks that had thrived in the shadows for far too long. The woman who had once cleaned Edmund's toilets was about to become something that would make international criminal organizations question every assumption they had about the vulnerability of their operations. And she was just getting started. In the federal building's corridors, where decisions that shaped national security were made daily, Maria Santos was about to discover whether the government she had served through her devastating effectiveness was prepared to embrace methods that challenged every conventional approach to law enforcement. The girl who had dreamed of bringing her family to America was gone forever. In her place stood someone who had learned that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to become more dangerous than the predators who hunted them. The transformation was complete. Maria Santos no longer existed as the broken woman who had scrubbed floors and endured humiliation. In her place stood something that federal authorities had never encountered: someone whose methods defied classification within their established protocols. The government would have to decide whether to embrace this new reality or watch her continue her crusade through channels they could not control or monitor. 3 days after Edmund's arrest, Maria found herself in a conference room 30 floors above Washington, D.C., surrounded by officials whose names never appeared in public records. These were the people who made decisions that shaped international policy, who authorized operations that officially never happened, who understood that sometimes protecting democracy required methods that democratic institutions couldn't publicly acknowledge. Deputy Director Harrison studied the files spread across the mahogany table, each document representing months of intelligence gathering that had been accomplished by a single person operating without backup, training, or official sanction. The scope of what Maria had achieved challenged every assumption his agency held about individual capabilities and organizational penetration. "Ms. Santos," he began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to discussing matters of national security, "what you've accomplished is unprecedented in our experience. A civilian with no formal training has infiltrated and documented a criminal network that our best agents couldn't penetrate in over a decade of trying." Maria's response was immediate and unflinching. "Deputy Director, your agents failed because they approached Edmund's organization using methods designed for conventional criminals." Edmund wasn't conventional. He was a predator who understood that the greatest weapon against investigation was the assumption that civilized people wouldn't use uncivilized methods. The distinction cut to the heart of why traditional law enforcement had failed so completely against Edmund's network. Agents bound by constitutional protections, legal procedures, and bureaucratic oversight could never match the ruthless efficiency of someone who had abandoned such constraints in service of a higher justice. The intelligence you've provided extends far beyond Edmund Blackwood's personal operations, continued Assistant Director Rodriguez, gesturing towards satellite photos and financial records that painted a disturbing picture of global criminal enterprise. You've identified trafficking routes, money laundering operations, and political corruption networks spanning dozens of countries. How did you gain access to this level of information? Maria's smile contained no warmth, only the satisfaction of someone who had systematically dismantled her enemies through superior planning and execution. I gained access by becoming invisible, Assistant Director. While your agents announced their presence through official channels, I existed as background noise in Edmund's world. People discuss their secrets freely around those they consider beneath notice. The revelation highlighted a fundamental flaw in conventional intelligence gathering. Highly trained agents, despite their skills and resources, remained identifiable as threats to sophisticated criminal organizations. But a domestic servant, especially one who appeared broken and compliant, could observe and record without triggering defensive measures. The financial analysis alone represents work that would typically require teams of forensic accountants months to complete, added Director Walsh from the Treasury Department. You've traced cryptocurrency transactions through multiple exchanges, identified shell company ownership structures, and documented cash flow patterns that reveal the true scope of this criminal enterprise. Maria leaned forward slightly, her posture indicating engagement without submission. Director Walsh, I had advantages your forensic accountants lack. I had unlimited time, unrestricted access, and most importantly, I had motivation that transcends professional obligation. When someone murders your entire family, you discover capabilities you never knew existed. The room fell silent as the officials processed the implications of what they were hearing. This wasn't simply exceptional intelligence gathering. This was the result of psychological transformation, so complete that it had created someone capable of operating at levels that challenged institutional understanding of human limitations. Deputy Director Harrison broke the silence with a question that had been troubling him since reviewing Maria's files. Miss Santos, the precision of your planning, the sophistication of your surveillance techniques, the depth of your financial analysis, these skills suggest training that extends far beyond what grief and determination alone could produce. Are you certain you haven't received assistance from other agencies? Maria's laugh was soft, but carried an edge that made several officials shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Deputy Director, you're asking whether I'm secretly a trained intelligence operative because you can't accept that someone without formal training could accomplish what your agencies failed to achieve. That assumption reveals more about institutional limitations than it does about my capabilities. The response was both an answer and a challenge, forcing the officials to confront uncomfortable truths about their own effectiveness. Maria had succeeded where they had failed, using nothing but intelligence, patience, and absolute commitment to her mission. What we're discussing here, said Director Chen from Homeland Security, is a partnership that has no precedent in federal law enforcement. You're proposing to operate with official backing while using methods that exist outside our legal framework. How do we justify such an arrangement to oversight committees? Maria's expression grew serious, revealing the calculating mind that had orchestrated Edmund's downfall with surgical precision. Director Chen, you justify it by results. In 6 months, I've accomplished more against international human trafficking than your agencies have managed in decades of investigation. The question isn't whether my methods fit your legal framework. The question is whether you're willing to adapt that framework to achieve results that traditional approaches cannot deliver. The proposal represented a fundamental shift in how government agencies approached criminal networks that operated beyond conventional law enforcement capabilities. It would require creating new authorities, establishing unprecedented oversight mechanisms, and accepting risks that challenged institutional comfort zones. Deputy Director Harrison exchanged glances with his colleagues, recognizing that they were discussing something that could redefine American intelligence operations. Assuming we could establish the legal framework for such a partnership, what specific authorities would you require? Maria's response revealed the depth of planning that had gone into her proposal. I would need access to international databases, authority to operate in foreign jurisdictions, and, most importantly, protection from prosecution for methods that civilian investigators cannot legally employ. She paused, allowing the implications to register with each official present. But I would also accept oversight mechanisms that ensure accountability. I'm not seeking a license for unlimited action. I'm seeking the tools necessary to complete the work I've already begun. The distinction was crucial. Maria wasn't proposing to operate without constraints. She was proposing to operate with different constraints, ones designed around effectiveness rather than procedural compliance. The intelligence community has protocols for managing human assets, offered Director Martinez from the CIA. But those protocols assume agents who've been recruited and trained through established channels. You're proposing something entirely different. Maria nodded, acknowledging the unprecedented nature of her situation. Director Martinez, I'm proposing a partnership between equals, not a handler-asset relationship. I've already proven my capabilities independently. What I'm offering is to align those capabilities with national security objectives. And so Maria Santos transformed from a grieving maid into something that criminal networks worldwide would soon learn to fear. Edmund Blackwood thought he was breaking a helpless servant, but instead created the architect of his own destruction. The woman who once cleaned his toilets became the force that dismantled his entire empire, proving that sometimes justice wears the face of those we least expect.